A stout is a beer that's defined by its signature dark brown to black color, with a defining note of roastiness that's similar to coffee or chocolate. The style can trace its roots back across the pond, but since its inception, the style has grown in diversity and popularity to include things like the dry Irish stout, an oatmeal stout, a milk stout, an oyster stout, a pastry stout, a coffee stout, and even an imperial stout. Each of these have their own differences, ranging from ABV to raw ingredients, or what kind of adjuncts are added to the actual grain bill. So for this batch of beer, I'm pulling inspiration from both an oatmeal stout and a pastry stout to try and create a final beer that tastes like a chocolate raspberry cake. So let's get brewing. Any great beer starts with water, as it makes up 90% of the final product. I'm going to start with 2.5 gallons of reverse osmosis water that I'm going to pour directly into my GigaWort brew kettle. As this water heats up to my strike temp, I'm going to add in my brew salts to closely match the burn-on-trend water profile, with some slight adjustments. For the stout, I'm aiming for a mash temp that's somewhere between 150 to 153 to get a fuller-bodied final beer. And once it comes up to temperature, I'm going to add in my mesh bag to that GigaWort brew kettle to act as a mash tun. Using a mesh bag like this is what we call brew in the bag, which is a great way to start brewing all grain beer, as you only really need one vessel and a mesh bag to do this. Also a note with BIAB is that I double crush my grains at the brew store to achieve a finer crush, excluding the flaked oats of course. Then for this grain bill, I have 2.1 pounds of Marris Otter, 2.1 pounds of Golden Promise, 0.3 pounds of Chocolate Malt, 0.2 pounds of Crystal Malt, a half a pound of Flaked Oats, and 0.1 pounds of Roasted Barley. After it's all added in, I'm going to mix it up and break up any dough balls that formed, and having brewed several batches on this system, I find that I need to mix up the grain and the liquid about every 10 minutes to achieve uniform heating from top to bottom. After a 45-minute mash, I increased the temperature to 168 degrees for a mash out, and then I began recycling the wort over the grain bed until it starts to become clear. Since I have a second brew kettle at my disposal, I decided to see if I could slowly drain the wort into the kettle and see if this would improve my overall efficiency, as I only normally get about 60% using my normal method. As the hot liquid is drained in the second kettle, I'm going to pour 0.5 gallons of 170 degree water over the grain bed to rinse the sugars off the grain and collect about 2.5 gallons of wort in the second kettle. Doing this method actually gained me 0.005 points on my original gravity, increasing my efficiency up to 70%. At the beginning of the boil, I'm going to add my one and only hop addition, which is 1 ounce of East Kent Goldings for bitterness, and I boiled this wort for about 40 minutes to get down to 2 gallons of wort total. I did add my wort chiller and some yeast nutrient with 10 minutes left in the boil to help sanitize them, and then I cooled the wort down to 65 degrees Fahrenheit for pitching temp. I then poured the wort into a clean and sanitized keg for fermentation, and the yeast choice for this stout is a classic WLP002 or English ale yeast, as it's said to leave some residual sweetness to accentuate the malt and also add some minor fruity notes. After adding the whole packet into the keg, I sealed it up and added a blow-off tube to the gas inside and submerged it into a jar sanitizer. The original gravity for this beer came in at 1.070, which gave me, as I said before, a 70% brewhouse efficiency. I let the yeast ferment away for 5 days, and once it slowed down, I knew it was time to add some fruit. The night before this happened, I defrosted 20 ounces of frozen organic raspberries, and I added 2 bags, 10 ounces each, to a sanitized mesh bag with the fermentation weight. Using frozen fruit like this helps release the juices and breaks down the cell wall in the fruit. And I like adding the fruit into a weighted bag so the fruit sits below the liquid level to ensure maximum content with the beer. Then it was time to add the fruit directly to my keg, and as I picked up the bag and added to the opening, the juice went everywhere. And it was about that time he realized he may be but then he remembered this statement. I cleaned up the keg off camera, but not before adding the raspberry juice that was left behind. I sprayed on the top of the keg before resealing it with some sanitizer and continued to let it ferment away for 2 more days. On day 7 of this brew process, I want to make a cacao nib tincture to increase the chocolate flavor in the overall final beer. So to do this, I added 2 ounces of cacao nibs to a mason jar and poured some vodka over it until the nibs were fully saturated. I allowed this to do its magic for 2 weeks in my basement, and now just before kegging, I wanted to do a dosing experiment to determine the correct amount of cacao nib tincture to add, as well as some vanilla extract. So I pulled a 200 ml sample from the fermenter and found that the final gravity at this point was 1.010. And then I began to add a half a teaspoon of tincture and a half a teaspoon of vanilla extract at a time, and I found that when I got to about 1 teaspoon of each of those in a 200 ml sample, that was a sweet spot for me.
This is perfect.
After 2 weeks of the cacao nib steeping in the vodka, it was time to separate the solids from the liquids and place that into a clean mason jar using a strainer to catch any of the solids. In the end, I got about 65 grams of cacao nib tincture, and I knew I wanted an equal weight of vanilla extract, so I just poured the vanilla extract directly into the tincture, and then add that directly to the serving keg. And I purged the keg 3 times with CO2 before pressure transferring the stout into it, and here's the results. The stout is beautifully clear as I cold crash it under 10 psi of CO2 in my garage for 2 days, as the garage is an ambient temperature of 44 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a slight red tint to the foam on top from the raspberries, and the aroma reminds me of raspberry lollipops. Now on the taste, I'm sorry to say it does not taste like cake. However, it does taste 100% like raspberry Tootsie Pops.
Mr. Owl, how many licks does it take to get to the Tootsie Roll center of a Tootsie Pop?
Let's find out. 1, 2, 3.
How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? The world may never know.
The body's on the thin side, and I personally think it could have done with a little bit more roastiness to balance out the Tootsie Pop sweetness flavor. But overall, it's great that this beer has 0 off flavors, and everything I added to this recipe can be tasted in the final product. But next time, I hope to increase the body, the roastiness, and find a way to get a less artificial tasting chocolate raspberry flavor in the beer. If you have any suggestions, throw them down in the comments, and I'll give it a try the next time I brew this beer. Thank you for watching to the end, and if you want to see what else I have brewed on tap, click the video on the screen now.